All right, folks, we are doing a fun mini episode today. And when I say mini episode, I mean a full-length episode, but it's only one part, I guess. So maybe that's what makes it mini now. I'm not sure. But we're going to be talking about First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln and her seances at the White House, and really her relationship with spiritualism as a whole. Harley is actually the one who let me steal her idea for this one. So thank you. I had the best time researching this.
I'm really excited for you to tell me about it.
So I wasn't totally sure how much I was going to find when doing this episode, but it turns out there's quite a bit. So rather than trying to summarize Mary Todd's life as a whole, which is what I started out doing, I opted to really zero in on the seances and again, her connection to mediums and spiritualists. But of course, I have to give you some context. But I would also be untrue to myself if I didn't throw out a mention of Cole Escola's one-act play, Oh Mary, which is playing on Broadway as we speak.
Oh, I've seen, wasn't he on Jimmy Fallon? Or
Yes,
Jimmy Kimmel
he's been
recently?
on like all the late night shows, recently. And I've watched all these interviews and he's absolutely hilarious. And Carrie and I were talking about this last night. I think we're going to go try to see it before it closes in November.
That's awesome.
So I have not had the pleasure to watch it. I don't think there's a lot of overlap between what I'm going to talk about and what is in the play. But I know for all the theater lovers out there, I had to at least throw out a mention. I hear you. I see you. I'm one with you. Anyways, so let's get started with a little history on who Miss Mary Todd Lincoln was and why she became a fan of seances.
Let's do it.
She's Sarah.
She's Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress. Mary Todd was born into a wealthy family on December 13th, 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky.
Taylor Swift's birthday.
Oh, wait, I forgot about that. Okay.
It's a magical day.
Interesting. I mean, Mary Todd was that girl, it seems.
Yeah,
so we'll
it'll
get
be
into
150 years later.
So Mary Todd's father, Robert Smith Todd, was a prominent businessman and politician serving at different times as a justice of the peace, sheriff, clerk of the State House of Representatives, and he was also elected for a term in the Kentucky Senate. Mary Todd's birth mother was named Elizabeth Parker, and she was also from a prominent Kentucky family herself. However, it is the 1800s, and wouldn't you guess it, but Mary Todd Lincoln's mother died in childbirth when Mary Todd was only 6 years old. And that happened in 1825. Just a year later, in 1826, her father married a new woman named Elizabeth, or Betsy, Humphreys. And for the record, Mary and her new stepmother did not get along great. So Mary Todd ended up spending a lot more time with her grandmother growing up. At the time, though, Lexington was so wealthy and cultured, it was considered the Athens of the West. Mary Todd herself received a great education for the times, concentrated in French and literature, and she also mingled with members of high society and politicians like Henry Clay, who just so happened to be the Todd's neighbor.
And he was in the episode about Philip Barton Key. So,
yes.
Little throwback.
So actually you're going to love this. There is a little bit of overlap too later in this episode that I won't tease out right now.
Also, I'm cracking myself up. This is so dumb, but when you said the Athens of the West, I was just like, Athens, Georgia?
Yes, exactly. The pinnacle of culture. And I can say that because I went to the University of Georgia. Culture and insight and intellect.
The Athens, Georgia of the West. I'm here for it.
Again, I won't bark in your ears, but just know, listener, I'm barking.
Spiritually,
I'm barking. So when Mary Todd was almost 21, she moved to Springfield, Illinois to live with her sister Elizabeth Porter Edwards and her husband Ninian W. Edwards, who was the son of a former governor. Mary Todd was kind of living a brat summer kind of life in Springfield. A childhood friend described her as saying that she, quote unquote, now and then could not restrain a witty, sarcastic speech that cut deeper than she intended. And also while living in Springfield, a fellow lawyer described her as, quote unquote, the very creature of excitement.
So, in other words, she was just a girl who is a little messy and likes to party and maybe says dumb things sometimes.
Yeah, no, I think she's brat. Mary Todd Lincoln is brat. Mary Todd was also very popular in Springfield's high society and was even courted by Democrat Party politician Stephen A. Douglas, who ended up defeating her future hubby, Abraham Lincoln, in the 1858 United States Senate election in Illinois. But then he lost to Lincoln in the 1960 United States presidential election.
Can you imagine having your ex run against your husband for president?
Yeah. No, I mean, they're all in the same circle. It's pretty nuts.
Crazy.
So as I alluded to, while in Springfield, Mary Todd met a 6'4" man named Abraham. Mary Todd herself was 5'2", which I just cannot judge at all. And honestly, I really relate to because I myself am 5'2" and my fiance is 6'3". So
I'm 5'8" and my husband's 6'2", so it's a little bit closer. But it's very much giving like a Sabrina Carpenter, Travis Kelce type height difference.
Polly Pocket, versus Wolverine.
Hulk.
Yeah, exactly. And just apart, not even just talking about their height difference, but Mary Todd and Abraham Lincoln were seriously polar opposites in every single way. While Mary Todd was known as vivacious and impulsive and witty, Abe was awkward and shy and just kind of standoffish. And Mary Todd was also from a wealthy, prominent family and received a hell of an education, while Abe, as we know, born in a log cabin and very much self-taught. Honestly, the only thing they had in common was losing their mother at an early age.
It sounds like Mary was the extrovert that just adopted Abraham and was like, hey, you're going to come with me.
Totally.
Like, I see potential
I get
here.
those vibes as well.
I love it.
So we don't know a ton about Mary and Abe's courtship, but we do know that their relationship for a time was broken off. And even after Abe's death, Mary apparently admitted that during their courtship, she, quote unquote, I doubtless trespassed many times and oft upon his great tenderness and amiability of character.
So she cheated?
I don't think so. I think maybe she...
trespassed.
I know. I think maybe she just felt like she walked all over him. Is kind of how I read that.
Okay.
But...
And cheating back then could have just been, like, writing someone a letter.
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot about their relationship that I had in the first iteration of this episode that I cut out just because there wasn't... First of all, there's a lot more on the seances than I originally thought. And then I was like, I'm kind of getting away from like what the core of this episode is supposed to be. But I have all of it in a different document. So maybe that'll be a different episode, just kind of going over Mary Todd and Lincoln's relationship. Because there's this one historian who really paints this pretty like dismal and miserable picture of their marriage. And that Mary Todd was like this, thorn in the side of Lincoln. And that he only ever married her out of, like, this weird, like, obligation and yada yada. So there's a lot more in that.
Crazy. But, so what we need to know is that she's just a little messy.
She's brat. She's brat.
Okay.
However, no matter what, the two ended up rekindling, and on November 4th, 1842, Mary Todd married Abraham Lincoln at her sister Elizabeth's home in Springfield. She was 23 years old. He was 33 years old.
Not the worst for this period of time, but
1000%.
I don't like it.
About 9 months after their wedding, Mary Todd gave birth to the couple's first son, Robert Todd Lincoln, on August 1st, 1843. The next year, Mary Todd had another son named Edward Baker Lincoln, known as Eddie, who would die of age 3 of tuberculosis. In 1850 and then 1853, the couple would have 2 more sons, William Wallace Lincoln, known as Willie, and Thomas Lincoln, known as Tad. Spoiler alert, Robert would be the only of Lincoln's children that would outlive both of his parents. But we'll get to Willie and Tad's deaths a little bit later. During 1847 and 1858, Abe served his one and only term in Congress and also had 2 unsuccessful Senate campaigns. During the ups and downs of Abe's career, it seems that Mary had this kind of shift in demeanor. She became unpredictable and prone to frequent, frenzied outbursts that left listeners scandalized. That's a quote. And the death of Eddie in 1850 also plunged her into this really deep depression, and she was so distressed that she could not care for her other children or herself for a time. It also didn't help that during this time, Abe was often away from home campaigning and working.
I don't blame her at all. Think about, there's no understanding of postpartum depression. There's very little understanding about mental health. You're grieving the loss of children,
Child, yes.
And
her mother died at an early age, too. I think that also left.
And her husband's not there.
Yeah.
And then, the ups and downs of a career in politics is distressing. So I don't blame her at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the same. And she also was she's an emotional person anyways, which, I mean, same.
Mm-hmm.
So I get it, and so, and she's also very outspoken. She's not, it's like this calm, reserved woman that, kind of was like the ideal back then, right? So people already thought she was like a little unhinged when she really just was a normal woman.
Right.
As well. But in 1860, things really turned around for Abe, who received the Republican nomination for president with running mate Hannibal Hamlin in May of 1860. And they won the presidential election as the first Republican president in a four-way race on November 6, 1860.
Yay for Abe! Honest Abe in the White House!
We did it. We did it, Joe. We did it. Unfortunately, though, Lincoln's victory immediately triggered the declarations of succession by South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas from December 1860 to February 1861. These states were, as we know, pro-slavery, and Lincoln's anti-slavery stance was seen as a threat. And just about a month after Abe took office as the 16th president of the United States, on March 4th, 1861, Confederate soldiers fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, thus starting the American Civil War.
I guess I didn't realize how connected his election was with the start of the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, tensions had really been growing, and that was kind of like the final trigger that these states were like, no way, Jose. Gotta get out. Yeah, boo, hiss.
Buffoons.
Mary Todd's tenure as First Lady was consumed by the war, which I think did not help her struggles for mental health, naturally. She felt this immense pressure to convey a sense of stability and status quo at the White House, and as part of this, she redecorated the White House and dressed in European-style attire made by her personal dressmaker, personal confidant, and former slave, Elizabeth Keckley. While at first this was seen as cool and fun, Mary ended up drawing a lot of criticism later for going way over budget and plunging her family into debt.
She has to be the most relatable First Lady.
Right? The entire time I was reading this, I was like, no, same.
She's an extrovert who overspends, is really emotional, a little messy out there, says some crazy things.
Yes.
I love her.
She kept it real.
Yeah.
She kept it real. Also controversial during this time were her own family connections. So not only did some people see her as a Western hick, again, she's from Kentucky, but 8 of her siblings supported the Confederacy through marriage or military service. Despite this, though, she was known to host balls and visit Union troops.
It also bugs me, and we see this all the time, but when people who are in the public eye are judged for what their family members do.
Right.
It's like, come on.
I have no control over them.
Mm-hmm.
What am I supposed to do?
Exactly. No, it bugs me because I just think, I'm like, all right, I have 4 siblings. Like, I don't want to be responsible for what comes out of their mouth.
Yeah. I have no say, no responsibility. I don't know you.
I wash my hands of all that.
Regardless, still seen as very controversial. Mm-hmm. She also had, at one point, some family members come to the White House to visit, because they're family. And the president's inner circle was like, why are you here? But barely a year into Abe's presidency, personal tragedy struck the Lincoln household when Willie, at age 11, died from typhoid fever.
Oh my gosh, losing 2 children.
Yeah. This was devastating to both Abe and Mary, but Mary took things really hard. She was inconsolable and took to bed for 3 weeks. The wives of Lincoln's cabinet members actually had to care for Tad, their other son, during this time, who also had typhoid fever himself, but eventually recovered. Mary couldn't even bring herself to attend Willie's funeral, and she never re-entered the room where Willie died. Elizabeth Keckley, her dressmaker, relayed that Mary was an altered woman after Willie's death. Mary blamed herself for Willie's death and believed God was punishing her for her vanity. Abe and close family members and friends worried for her sanity.
It sounds like she was really struggling with some serious mental health issues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Can you imagine not having the resources that we have today?
No.
When you feel like that?
Yeah.
I'd have to take care of my mental health just to get through day-to-day stuff.
Right.
So having no idea how to do that, what that even means, and dealing with the loss of children in the public eye.
In the public eye, when a war, a civil war is happening.
Oof.
Yeah. That's a lot. But this loss mirrored the immense loss that the rest of the nation was actually feeling at the time as the Civil War continued on. Here's a fact that I didn't realize, but the Civil War resulted in approximately 750,000 American fatalities, which is almost the number of American deaths in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined.
Whoa.
Yeah. That's a lot of death.
Yeah.
But to make it worse, loved ones were often felt without the sense of closure, because word traveled slowly and reports of death were often inaccurate or simply unknown. I mean, bodies were left on the battlefield, so many people never made it home for their final resting.
That's insane. But I guess it makes sense because it was Americans fighting Americans. So every death was an American death. But jeez, almost 1 million people.
Heartbreaking. Again, just like this lack of closure for an entire nation, it seems. This nationwide struggle with grief gave way to the greater acceptance and practice of spiritualism, which is built on the doctrine that the dead can communicate with the living. Now I'm going to start with the facts by reading this excerpt from the White House Historical Association. Shortly after Willie's death, Mary Todd was introduced to the Lorries, a well-known group of mediums that were located in Georgetown. Mrs. Lincoln found comfort from the seances held by the group that she started hosting her own seances in the Red Room of the White House. There's evidence to suggest that she hosted as many as 8 seances in the White House, and that her husband was even in attendance for a few of them. The seances proved to be such an effective coping mechanism for Mrs. Lincoln that she once remarked to her half-sister that, quote-unquote, Willie lives. He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of my bed with the same sweet, adorable smile that he always has had. He does not always come alone. Little Eddie, her son that perished at age 3-4, is sometimes with him. And there's also a newsletter from the National Archives that states this as well.
Completely unrelated, was she known to use any drugs?
This good question. Not that I found. Yeah. She's seeing ghosts.
I mean, I'm glad she's finding a way to cope.
Yeah.
So good for her.
There's something there, perhaps. She's seeing ghosts. She's having visions. This is her testimony. It's her testimony.
It was real. It was real to me.
Yeah.
What was that sound from? I don't even remember.
I don't either.
I don't know.
It's a good one, yeah. Now, I'm going to be very honest. Researching these actual seances is really hard, and I could not find a ton of reputable sources, so this is my very best research on the topic. But this is a fun mini episode, and how about you just enjoy, perhaps your own research, and take everything with a grain of salt. So who are the Lorries? The Lorries referred to Crankston and Margaret Ann Lorry and their daughter Belle. Crankston was appointed to a position in the Post Office Department during Andrew Jackson administration, and it seems like he worked there during the Lincoln administration as well. The Lorries did have other 2 sons and an adopted daughter, but Mother Margaret Ann and the daughter Belle had the real medium abilities, essentially. The Lorries' Georgetown home became a hub for spiritualism and seances by the 1850s. One report allegedly from the Evening Star stated that in March of 1854, quote-unquote, the Lorries were present in a seance that summoned the spirit of famous Congressman and Secretary of State Daniel Webster. And during that seance, Webster apparently revealed that some Nebraska bill would never pass Congress.
So he came all the way from the other side to tell us that some random bill was just doomed to fail?
Right. And there's not a ton of detail on this, so I did a little side research to maybe figure out what maybe was cooking at Congress in the time. I didn't think I would find something, but this is actually pretty interesting. I think it could be a reference to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, fun fact, was led by Stephen Douglas, Mary Todd's quote-unquote ex. And it actually repealed the Missouri Compromise. So in the midst of these national tensions over slavery, the signing of this bill, which was signed on May 30th, 1854, so a couple months after the seance, it prompted these violent uprisings known as Bleeding Kansas. And remember, the bill passed, unlike what the Lorries or the Webster spirit, who had died 2 earlier, had predicted. Again, not sure if this is the Nebraska bill discussed, but I thought it's kind of a fun possibility.
This also might be the first ever recorded instance of lobbying from beyond the grave.
Yeah. It's like, it's not going to pass. It's not going to pass.
We should bring that back, actually. We should have these, like, lobbyists should get more creative and bring, like, Ouija boards. Like, all right, let's see what Abraham Lincoln has to say about this bill.
What would George Washington, what does your spirit have to say about education reform right now?
Forget trying to understand the founder's intent. Let's ask them.
Yeah, exactly. Let's stop guessing. Mm-hmm. Let's just ask the spirits themselves.
I mean, it could work. No, don't ask Daniel Webster, because he's wrong.
Yeah,
But
he's not too good at this.
not the best lobbyist.
Yeah, maybe FDR, though, would have better luck. JFK.
Yeah. I mean, you could put together an all-star lobbying team from Beyond the Grave.
Killer. Very influential.
Probably wouldn't have to pay them either. So I don't even really know, what does a seance involve?
Okay, that's a great question. So short and sweet, a seance is an attempt to communicate with the spirits of the deceased. So sometimes during a seance, a spiritualist or a medium will go into this trance, which allows the spirit to take control of the body and the mind and the energy of the medium. So Margaret and Laurie's specialty for contacting spirits involved this magnetic technique that would allow her to transmit messages to those at her table. She and her husband Crimestituents also produced spirit drawings or works of arts produced, inspired by the spirits to whom they connected with. But the piece de la resistance was Belle, who is described as being a very powerful medium. She allegedly could play a levitating piano during the seances. A little more on that later. Historical accounts of the Lincolns' involvement with the Lauries and seances largely comes from this woman named Nettie Colburn Maynard. She was an associate to the Lauries and a fellow medium. So she wrote this account called Was Abraham Lincoln a Spiritualist?, which documents her experience with the Lincolns. The book was published in 1891. So again, let's say things with a grain of salt, but here's a summary of Nettie's experience with the Lincolns, because I read it and it's quite the account. So Nettie first met Mary Todd Lincoln when she went over to the Laurie's house after failing to get an army furlough for her sick brother. When she gets there, she meets none other than the famous First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln. Apparently, Mary was interested in seeing the trance medium, which Nettie was. However, Mary could tell that Nettie had been crying, and when she asked what was up, Nettie told her about her brother. Mary apparently replied, quote unquote, "Don't worry any more about it. Your brother shall have another furlough if Mr. Lincoln has to give it himself." And with that, Nettie was calm enough to have a spirit overtake her and control her. So during that first session with Mary, Nettie was in a trance for over an hour, and when she came out of it, Mary exclaimed, quote unquote, "This young lady must not leave Washington. I feel she must stay here, and Mr. Lincoln must hear what we have heard. It is all important, and he must hear it." So unknown exactly what Nettie said or what spirit overtook her, yada, 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 but Mary was loving it. And upon being asked to stay in Washington, Nettie kind of balked at first and essentially was like, hey, I have a living to make. I'm a lecturer. I can't just up and move. And Mary Todd was like, that's no problem at all. Because then she turns to the chief of the agricultural department, who was also at the seance this time. And he goes, hey, can you give this girl a job? And he's like, okay, sure.
I sense an ethics violation here, but I mean, I've also heard of worse ways to get a job.
Right, exactly. The next day, Nettie and Mrs. Laurie headed to the War Department, and sure enough, they got the furlough for Nettie's brother. From there, Nettie decided to resign from her position in Albany and move to D.C. Soon, Mrs. Laurie received an invite to the White House from Mary, asking her to also bring Nettie. So at 8 p.m. on a cold December night in 1862, Margaret, or Mrs. Laurie, Belle, and Nettie were received in the White House Red Room. Now, the account of what happened that night is just so fun, and I really want to read it in its entirety. So, Harley, can we get some music playing? Mrs. Lincoln received us graciously and introduced us to a gentleman and lady present whose names I have forgotten. Mr. Lincoln was not then present. While all were conversing pleasantly on general subjects, Mrs. Miller, Mr. Laurie's daughter, seated herself under control at the double grand piano at one side of the room, seemingly awaiting someone. Mrs. Lincoln was talking with us in a pleasant strain when suddenly Mrs. Miller's hands fell upon the keys with a force that betokened a master hand, and the strains of the grand march filled the room. As the measured notes rose and fell, we became silent. The heavy end of the piano began rising and falling in perfect time to the music.
So the piano was floating.
The piano was floating.
In the White House.
In the White House Red Room.
Wow.
All at once it ceased, and Mr. Lincoln stood upon the threshold of the room. He afterwards informed us that the first notes of music fell upon his ears as he reached the head of the grand staircase's descent, and that he kept step to the music until he reached the doorway. Mr. and Mrs. Laurie and Mrs. Miller were duly present, and then I was led forward and presented. He stood before me, tall and kindly, with a smile on his face. Dropping his hand upon my head, he said in a humorous tone, "So this is our little Nettie, is it, that we have heard so much about?" I could only smile and say, "Yes, sir," like any schoolgirl, when he kindly led me to an ottoman. Sitting down in the chair, the ottoman at his feet, he began asking me questions in a kindly way about my mediumship. I think he must have thought me stupid, as my answers were little beyond a yes and no. His manner, however, was genial and kind, and it was then suggested we form a circle. He said, "Well, how do you do it?" looking at me. Mr. Lorry came to the rescue and said that we had been accustomed to sit in a circle and join hands, but he did not think it would be necessary in this instance. While he was yet speaking, I lost all consciousness of my surroundings and passed under control. For more than an hour, I was made to talk to him, and I learned from my friends afterwards that it was upon matters that he seemed fully to understand, while they comprehended very little until that portion was reached that related to the forthcoming Emancipation Proclamation. He was charged not to abate the terms of its issue, and not to delay its enforcement as a law beyond the opening of the year, and he was assured that it was to be the crowning event of his administration and his life. And while he was being counseled by strong parties to defer the enforcement of it, hoping to delay its action, he must in no wise heed such counsel, but stand firm in his convictions and fearlessly perform the work and full mission for which he had been raised up by an overruling providence. Those present declared that they had lost sight of the timed girl and the majesty of the utterance, the strength and the force of the language, and the importance of which it was conveyed. It seemed to realize that some strong masculine spirit was giving speech to almost divine commands. I shall never forget the scene around me when I regained consciousness. I was standing in front of Mr. Lincoln, and he was sitting back in his chair, his arms folded upon his breast, looking intently at me. I stepped back, naturally confused at the situation, not remembering at once where I was, and glancing around the group, where perfect silence reigned. It took me a moment to remember my whereabouts. A gentleman present then said in a low voice, "Mr. President, did you notice anything peculiar in the method of address?" Mr. Lincoln raised himself. As if to shake off his spell, he glanced quickly at the full-length portrait of Daniel Webster that hung above the piano and replied, "Yes, and it is very singular, very," with marked emphasis. Mr. Sum said, "Mr. President, would it be improper for me to inquire whether there has been any pressure brought to bear upon you to defer the enforcement of the proclamation?" To which the President replied, "Under these circumstances, that question is perfectly proper, as we are all friends smiling upon the company. It is taking all my nerve and strength to withstand such a pressure." At this point, the gentlemen drew around him and spoke together in low voices, Mr. Lincoln saying least of all. At last he turned to me, and laying his hand upon my head, uttered these words in a manner I shall never forget. "My child, you possess a very singular gift, but that is of God, I have no doubt. Thank you for coming here tonight. It is more important than perhaps anyone present can understand. I must leave you all now, but I hope to see you again." He shook me kindly by the hand, bowed to the rest of the company, and was gone. We remained an hour later, talking to Mrs. Lincoln and her friends, and then returned to Georgetown. Such was my first interview with Abraham Lincoln, and the memory of it is as clear and vivid as the evening on which it occurred.
So just making sure I understand, is she giving herself credit for giving him the idea for the Emancipation Proclamation?
Not the idea, but the idea that Lincoln should push it forward.
She lit a fire under him.
Yeah, which is interesting, but she's not taking credit like herself. She's saying that the spirit that overtook me is the one who delivered this message.
And did I miss it, or who was the spirit?
Not named in this one. It just kind of was like an authoritative male voice kind of coming through from how I read it.
I was not expecting these seances to be so policy focused.
Right? No, that's the best part about these seances. Most of them are very policy focused.
That's crazy. And so, I mean, realistically, this woman could just be pushing her own policy priorities in front of the president, pretending that's coming from beyond the grave.
Very likely. Very likely, probable. I'm not sure how much she knows at this point, too. You know, it's not Twitter land or X land now. So it's all, I don't know, it's all peculiar. It's all peculiar. But yes, in a world, she could just be giving her own policy positions and saying, "Oh, it's from the spirit."
Do you believe in mediums?
That's a great question. I think so. But I think it's something I don't want to mess with. Yeah.
I don't believe in, like, the Long Island medium.
Yeah, that's what
stuff,
I'm thinking
like
of.
the
Yeah.
TLC mediums. No. But I do feel like some people are just more in tune with spiritualism than others.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Like, I want to believe that something like this is possible, but I'm not quite there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I don't know. Again, this is also an account from the 1800s. Also, it was published, I believe, in 1891. So this is a good 30 years, give or take, from these moments, right? So she says it's, it's clear in my mind as the day it happened, but she's had 30 years to kind of, oh yeah, how did that happen? I don't know.
I'm shocked that it wasn't a scandal for there to be spiritualism in the White House this time.
So yeah, it was.
Oh, okay.
We'll kind of get into it a little bit later, but all these are pretty hush-hush. It's really the inner circle. These things aren't widely advertised. Even though the rest of the United States is kind of getting into spiritualism, it's still looked upon as very taboo and kind of mystic and yada, yada, yada. So they had to keep this on the DL, essentially, is what I'm saying.
Gotcha. But back to this. So she is just convinced Abraham Lincoln to push ahead with enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, in her own words.
Yes.
Crazy.
Mary informed the Lauries that she wanted to do a seance another evening at the Lauries' Georgetown home. Before the night started, Nettie was apparently controlled by a spirit that told her Mr. Lincoln would also be present that night. When Nettie told Mr. Laurie this, he doubted her, saying, quote unquote, "It would be hardly advisable for President Lincoln to leave the White House to attend a spiritual seance anywhere, and that he did not consider it good policy to do so." So, as I kind of mentioned earlier, again, very DL, very on the DL. However, that evening, when Mr. Laurie opened the door on February 5th, 1863, there stood Abe Lincoln himself. Mr. Laurie exclaimed, "Welcome, Mr. Lincoln, to my humble roof. You were expected." Which also, first of all, we were doubting our girl Nettie.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, oh, he's expected?
Also, what an amazing skill to know if someone's going to come over to your house.
Yeah. I would benefit from that.
I would love that. I would never answer my door.
If my roommates are having people over, I'm like, okay, mentally prepare. I'm not going to be home alone tonight.
Or you're throwing a party. It's like, all right, mentally prepare. These people are going to show up without telling me.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing. That's the only thing I would use my medium skills for.
I just want to know who's coming to my house. All right, cue the music. Here's more from Nettie on this night. Mr. Lincoln stepped in the act of removing his cloak and said, "Expected? Why, it is only 5 minutes since I knew I was coming." He came down from a cabinet meeting as Mrs. Lincoln and her friends were about to enter the carriage and asked them where they were going. She replied, "To Georgetown, to a circle." He answered immediately, "Hold on a moment, I will go with you." "Yes," said Mrs. Lincoln, "and I was never so surprised in my life." He seemed pleased when Mr. Laurie explained the source of our information, and I think it had a tendency to prepare his mind to receive what followed and to obey the instructions given. So what followed that night was Nettie went into a trance and was taken by this spirit named Old Dr. Bamford, who apparently had a quaint dialect and old-fashioned methods of expression. The spirit of Bamford allegedly was able to discuss the state of the war with Lincoln and even give him recommendations on how to proceed. The spirit then said Lincoln would also be renominated and reelected to the presidency. Following the possession, Lincoln's friends looked at him to say, hey, is the war really in that type of a position? To which Lincoln allegedly said, "They can hardly be exaggerated. But I ask it as a favor to all present that they do not speak of these things. The major there has just brought dispatches to me from the front depicting the state of affairs pretty much as our old friend has shown. And we were just having a cabinet meeting regarding the matter when something, I don't know what, induced me to leave the room and come downstairs when I found Mrs. Lincoln in the act of coming here. I felt it might be of service for me to come." That same night, Nettie wrote that Belle, called Mrs. Miller in this account, started her piano playing business. Music, please. Mrs. Miller played upon the piano, a three-cornered grand, and under her influence it rose and fell, keeping time to her touch in a perfectly regular manner. Mr. Laurie suggested that as an added test of the invisible power that moved the piano, Mrs. Miller, his daughter, should place her hand on the instrument, standing at arm's length away from it to show that she was in no wise connected to its movement other than as its agent. Mr. Lincoln then placed his hand underneath the piano at the end nearest Mrs. Miller, who placed her hand upon his to demonstrate that neither strength nor pressure was used. In this position, the piano rose and fell a number of times at her bidding. At Mr. Laurie's desire, the president changed his position to another side, meeting with the same result. The president, with a quaint smile, said, "I think we can hold down that instrument." whereupon he climbed upon it, sitting with his legs dangling over the side, and so did Mr. Soames and Mr. Case, and a soldier in uniform from the Army of the Potomac. The piano, notwithstanding this enormous added weight, continued to rise and fall until the sitters were glad to vacate the premise. And Mr. Lincoln expressed himself perfectly satisfied that the motion was caused by some invisible power.
I'm impressed. Not gonna lie. The fact that she knew he was gonna come when he didn't. The fact that she had understandings of the front lines of the war, which wouldn't have been public information necessarily.
Totally not.
I mean, I'm not gonna say I'm convinced, but that's some pretty compelling information that she has right there.
And again, it's one person's point of view. You know, we don't have an account from Mary Todd, you know, or Abe, who were to say, yeah, no, for real, we saw this and it was like crazy and we can't explain it.
Can you imagine that soldier going home being like, babe, you're never going to believe it today.
Do you want to know what just happened at this Georgetown house? Yeah.
I sat on a floating piano with Abraham Lincoln.
Tonight was a movie.
Yeah. A horror movie.
Yeah. So sometime a couple months or weeks later, Nettie is invited again to the White House. And this story might be my favorite because it involves a man that we've covered before on this podcast. Let's see if you can guess who it is.
Ooh, I'm excited. I want to say Philip Key, but we'll see.
It seems around this time that perhaps Mary Todd and at least some members of her inner circle were doubting the medium's ability because when Nettie and company arrived to the Red Room, they were met by a man in a long military cloak that covered up his rank and any other identifying traits. Mary Todd does not introduce him and says, "I'd like for you to tell me who he is." A little later, Abe himself comes in the room and essentially says, "I have a very busy schedule, but I'd like to see what our little friend, talking about Nettie, has to say." Nettie then goes into a trance, and the spirit tells Abe this and that about the war, but then turns attention to the man in the military cloak and calls him General. Then Nettie was overtaken by another spirit named Pinky, who was, quote-unquote, a little Indian maiden. She addressed the man in the military cloak as Crooked Knife, his Indian name. Any guesses who the general was?
Was it Sickles?
Yes!
A crooked knife?
Yes!
Ooh, she slayed with that.
Isn't that awesome? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, it's none other than Major General Daniel Sickles, the man who back in 1859 shot and killed his wife's lover, Philip Barton Key, in broad daylight. If you remember, Philip Barton Key was the son of Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, and Sickles was acquitted of the crime through the first successful use of the temporary insanity defense in the United States. If you haven't already, you've got to go back and listen to part 1 and 2 of that series because Harley absolutely killed it.
But not as much as Nettie killed the Crooked Knife.
Right? I just was like, oh my gosh. So, and also after this happened, I kind of didn't turn too much on. I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but Mary Todd was essentially satisfied with that. She was like, oh yeah, this girl's legit. She knew that, you know, A, this guy is a general, and that B, his, you know, Indian name was Crooked Knife, like a sickle, Daniel Sickles.
So are we talking Native American Indian?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha.
To
That's
be clear.
crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it actually turns out that the Lincolns and the Sickles were pretty tight. In the Library of Congress, there's a letter that Mary sent to Sickles a little after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And then there's a bit on this old Antique Roadshow episode where they showcase a necklace that Mary gave to Sickles and his wife Teresa upon the birth of the couple's daughter, Laura, in 1853.
You don't know it, but you're sitting next to someone who has spent countless hours watching Antique Roadshow. I did not have cable growing up.
Oh, my word.
My family was a PBS family.
Oh,
Still is a PBS family.
PBS is good stuff.
And so we would just watch whatever came on after our cartoons. And it was Antique Roadshow.
It was always Antique Roadshow.
And we would pretend like it was our favorite thing we've ever seen because we just wanted to stay up and watch TV so we didn't have to go to bed.
Yeah.
And so watching people with like their lamps and their rugs and their mugs.
Thrilling. It set the scene for the rest of your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. Does the name Rough Men mean anything to you?
You mean Rough with Rough Ruffman?
Yes.
I wanted to be on that show so bad. I think they only had like 3 seasons of it.
Yeah, but it made an impression.
Wait, no, it's Fetch with Rough Ruffman.
Fetch with Rough Ruffman, that's what it is. Yep.
Oh my gosh.
I love that, because I think it was Fetch with Rough Ruffman, and then I think it was Arthur. Mm-hmm. And those were the two, and I mean, boy, did I tear it up. It up. Yeah.
I also wanted to be on that Zaboomafoom with the animals.
So good. What was the other? There was another, like, was it like space or like future? There was another one that I...
Cyber Kids. Cyberspace? Cyber Kids?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was...
Cyber Chase. All the time. Do, 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 do.
So good. I mean, when my mom would, like, work late on Tuesday nights, I was watching the entire series. Anything that was on the docket, I was watching. And, wow.
I think that Fetch with Ruff Ruffman was my intro to reality TV.
What a great show.
Oh,
Bring that back. Bring that back.
I would go on it today.
If they did a reboot of Fetch with Ruff Ruffman.
Oh my gosh.
Sign
Sign me up. The 2 reality shows I want to be on more than anything are Fetch with Ruff Ruffman and the Supermarket Spree one where you, like, race. And,
that's
like,
a good one.
I mean, amazing.
Good. I'm glad that someone else remembers Fetch with Ruff Ruffman.
My cat is named Muffy off of Arthur. So...
Arthur's such a good show, too.
I might force my kids to be PBS kids.
Yeah.
Just
because
lore.
it's great content.
Yeah.
Can't go wrong.
No. It gives you personality, too.
Yeah. Look at that. We're talking about it years later.
Exactly. Okay, sorry. I don't even know how we got here.
Anyways. Anti-Crocher, that's how we got on this track.
Okay.
But going back to Daniel Sickles, one of his biographers has a slightly different account of this seance in his book, The American Scoundrel, The Life of the Notorious Civil War General Dan Sickles. So in this account, Sickles apparently concealed himself behind the draperies in the room, and it was asked of Nettie who was behind the curtain. Before she could answer, though, Abe walked in and said he couldn't stay too long, and then Nettie fell in this trance. So during the latter part of February and the month of March in 1864, Nettie also reported doing several more seances just for Mary Todd and Abe with no other witnesses. These seances usually happened around Abe's lunch hour. And with no witnesses, there's not a ton of information on what Nettie and the spirits that entranced her, like, really got into. And then also I read something that said that, yeah, Mary Todd really just wanted some alone time with Abe. And so she would, like, set up these, like, lunch hour seances, which I kind of love, too. So nothing really significant to report there. Just want to say that Nettie was a frequent visitor at the house. Mm-hmm. But the final seance I'd like to mention is one where she goes into a trance and awakes in front of a large map of the southern states with a pencil in her hand, and she had been tracing lines on it. And Abe is quoted in the memoir of saying, "It is astonishing how every line she has drawn conforms the plan agreed upon."
Fun? Like she was drawing military plans?
Yes, I assume that's what she was drawing.
Okay, what? I guess you would show, like, paths with a line? What military plan would you show with a line?
I'm thinking, well, so on the History Channel, they'll do, like, kind of, like, not really, but they'll, like, do X's and, like, circles and stuff. And I think maybe it was more like that.
Okay.
Or else it could be, like, the path that, like, the, you know, brigade or whatever was, like, going through. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Interesting,
We don't get into the details there. But Nettie in her memoir had one final meeting with Abe. This wasn't a seance. This was just a meeting. And this happened just before Lincoln's second inauguration. Let's cue the music one last time.
DJ Harley in the house. I'm going to cut that.
No, you keep that. From Nettie. Mr. Lincoln paused pleasantly at the compliment, and then turning to me remarked, "What do your friends say of us now? What they predicted for you, Mr. Lincoln, has come to pass," I answered, "and you are to be inaugurated a second time." He nodded his head, and I continued, "But they also reaffirm that the shadow they have spoken of still hangs over you." He turned half impatiently away and said, "Yes, I know. I have letters from all of the country from your kind of people, mediums, I mean, warning me against some dreadful plot against my life. But I don't think the knife is made or the bullet run that will reach it. Besides, nobody wants to harm me." A feeling of sadness that I could not conceal nor account for came over me, and I said, "Therein lies your danger, Mr. Lincoln, your overconfidence in your fellow men." The old melancholy look that had of late seemed to be lifted from his face now fell over it, and he said in his subdued, quiet way, "Well, Miss Nettie, I shall live till my work is done, and no earthly power can prevent it." Brightening again, he extended a hand to each of us, saying, "Well, I suppose I must bid you goodbye, but we shall hope to see you back next fall." "We certainly shall come," we replied, "if you are here," without thinking of the doubts our words implied. "It looks like it now," he answered, and walking with us to the side door, with another cordial shake of the hand, we passed out of his presence for the last time. Never again would we meet his welcome smile.
This woman looked at the President of the United States and said, hey, people hate you a lot more than you think. You're gonna die. And he's like, oh, no, I'll be fine. And she said, sure, maybe. If
I see you again. Yeah.
That is pretty brave.
Isn't it? Here's the other thing, too. Doesn't everyone at this point know how polarizing of a figure that, like, Lincoln would be? Like, I'm not a medium, but I could probably guess that at least someone wanted to cause some harm to him, right?
Yeah, I guess it's a safe enough guess to make, but when was this?
So this was right before his second inauguration.
All right, which would have put it in, like, December?
The inauguration was on March 4th, 1865, 41 days before his assassination.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and this was, like, the way she wrote it, it was, like, a week or two before.
Wow.
Yeah. So, of course, we know, as we just talked about, that harm does come to President Lincoln because on April 14th, 1865, 41 days after he was inaugurated, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by watching the comic play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater by Southern sympathizers. Whoa, guys. He was killed by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. Mary was holding Abe's hand when the bullet struck the back of his head.
Ugh, so sad. But, I mean, is this the ultimate American History Theater reference?
I think it has to be, right? Like, this also brought me on, like, a little tangent of, like, going back and, like, even seeing what, like, Our American Cousin was about. And it actually seems kind of interesting. I wonder if they, like, still put it on somewhere.
Maybe it's cursed.
Yeah. Maybe we should stay away from that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone should go see Our American Cousin.
Drat. The world will never know. Also, this reminds me of, like, one of my favorite jokes where someone says, but other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how's the play?
That's how working in politics feels.
Yeah.
But other than all of this terrible stuff that happened, how's it going?
Yeah, I just kind of missing the point and just, going straight for it. Funny enough, there was another spiritualist worth mentioning who also tried to warn Lincoln of the plot against his life, who allegedly attended some of the seances at the White House as well. His name was Charles J. Colchester. Smithsonian Magazine said that Charles was allegedly able to, quote-unquote, read sealed letters, cry out the names of visitors' deceased friends, cause apparitions to appear, and produce words on his forearm in blood-red letters.
Whoa.
Yeah. It turns out that Charles was a total fraud. Like, he would strap an electrical noisemaker to his bicep, and then he would be able to summon, quote-unquote, like, sounds from different parts of the room.
That's such a bummer.
Yeah. But not only was Charles a fraud, he was also a total D-bag and tried to blackmail Mary Todd into giving him a free railroad pass from the War Department. Luckily, Mary told this to Noah Brooks, a member of the president's inner circle, and went to confront Charles at one of his own seances at the Soldiers' Home, which essentially is like the presidential summer house back then.
I used to live down by that, actually. Isn't it,
really?
Like, I think it's off of Rock Creek Church Road.
Oh.
But yeah, it's pretty close by. It's just, you have to pay to go in, so I never went in.
Yeah, I really...
We're spoiled by all, like, the free museums and stuff around.
Why would I ever pay for a museum?
Exactly.
Except the Spy Museum. I pay for that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. But it's pretty close by, and I used to live, like, right across from it.
Huh. So at this seance that night, which it seems like Mary Todd did attend, everyone sat holding hands around a table where there was a drum and a banjo and a bell. The lights were then turned off and music began to play. Brooks unclasped his hands from the circle and thrust his hands towards where the music was playing, and his head crashed into something. But when a friend struck a match to see what had happened, it was revealed that Charles had been playing the bell and the drum all along.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Hate to see it.
Yeah, tough moment. Charles was very pissed and probably very embarrassed, and he stormed out of the room. Brooks caught up with him a few days later at the White House, and he allegedly said to him, and I love this quote, "You know that I know that you are a swindler and a humbug."
A buffoon.
Yeah, just like cutting. Deep cut. And interestingly enough, apart from the Lincolns, Charles also met with John Wilkes Booth, who also was interested in spiritualism and obviously had beef with Lincoln.
Yeah, clearly.
Acquaintances said the two were closer than friends and that Charles was Booth's associate, which could be nothing, but I don't know. Is it casual now?
What? So, this fraudster was pretending to be a spiritualist in the White House and is also friends with the president's future assassin.
Yes, and they're drinking buddies too. Like, every single dollar that it seems like Charles got, like, went straight to, like, whiskey. But, like, he and Wilkes were drinking buddies and then also, again, kind of associates because Booth had this interest in spiritualism as well.
I have done zero research, so this is just my own conspiracy theory. But I wonder if part of how, like, John Wilkes Booth was able to pull off his assassination was by ingratiating himself with some of the people who were in his orbit.
Right.
And was able to kind of figure out where the president would be and when by, like, drinking with his friends and acquaintances.
Right. Charles also was like this, you know, he warned Lincoln against this plot against his life, which begs the question.
Oh, right.
Is that, you know, that actually might be from an earthly source, John Wilkes Booth, rather than, like, a divine one, right?
Right. And since he was a fraudster, he was getting all of his stuff from, like, you know, little things he was able to pick up on.
Yeah.
So if ooh, that's interesting.
So that, it might be a weird thing where, like, yeah, someone warned him of it under this guise of being a medium, but Charles is like, actually, like, no, he's gonna kill you.
Or I wonder if he had heard about Nettie's prediction and was like, oh, I'm in safe hands if I decide with Nettie.
Yeah.
Interesting, though.
Yeah, right? It's all interesting.
I think we should just start a rumor that he knew that John Wilkes Booth was going to kill Lincoln.
Yeah.
I think he knew.
And I think that's not a far-fetched, yeah.
New conspiracy theory.
1,000%. Going back to Mary Todd Lincoln, Abe's death naturally plunged her into a deep depression, and she looked for help from the spiritualists like the Lauries. However, Mary and Abe's eldest son, Robert, threw out the mediums from the White House because he felt like they were preying on her vulnerability in the wake of Abe's death. Unfortunately, Robert also later used Mary's organization of the seances and meetings with mediums as part of his argument to have Mary institutionalized later.
Ooh, I don't like that.
Yeah.
But he probably did the right thing by protecting her a little bit, because they probably were preying on her, but also that was her only outlet.
Right. I think it was maybe a case of, like, too many cooks in the kitchen, right? She's getting this from this medium, this from this one, and I think it's maybe starting to drive her a little nuts, too. Yeah. So I think that the son was just like, we need to, let's have some silence. Let's start with silence.
That sounds like good judgment on his part.
Right? Yeah. But going back to Laurie's, and one other thing I wanted to mention, interestingly, the Chicago Historical Society, which runs the Chicago History Museum, has in their collection a lock of hair that was allegedly taken from the site of Abraham Lincoln's fatal bullet wound.
What?
Yes. It gets crazier. So the inscription with it reads, taken from President Lincoln's head after he was shot, cut from the spot where the ball passed through. Washington, D.C., April 26, 1866. Underneath it, it lists two names, Mrs. M. Laurie and Belle A. Youngs. Now, the Chicago Historical Society says there's no record of how the relic entered the collection, and the identities of Mrs. Laurie and Belle Youngs are unknown. However, some folks, I think perhaps me included, think that this refers to Margaret and Belle Laurie, and that Mary Todd sent them this lock of hair so they could reach him easier on the other side. I mean, I think it just makes sense. And, like, of course, it's, like, very hard to verify that, but pretty compelling, right?
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Right?
And Mary was there, so she could have, I mean, that's a wild reaction to have, like, oh my gosh, I need to steal his hair so that I can talk to him from beyond the grave.
Yeah.
In that moment. But
even if she just had the lock of hair that she wanted, and then later was like, hey, actually, this might help you, so I'm going to send you this lock of hair. I know. Isn't that kind of just a fun little, like, tidbit?
And also, why is it that when historians have locks of people's hair, it's history, but then when, like, Swifties want a lock of Taylor Swift's hair, it's just creepy and you're put on a list?
Yeah, the double standard is really unbelievable, actually.
To be clear, I do not want his lock of Taylor Swift's hair, but this feels like less history and more fangirling to me.
Gotta have it.
Also, Taylor, send me a lock of your hair.
Wait, yeah. If you're listening to this.
So I can reach you from beyond the grave.
In case something tragic happens. In case you don't live forever.
Cut that.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to leave that in.
I think you got it. Flash forward to 1870. Mary Todd went secretly to visit a man named William H. Mumler, who was a self-proclaimed spirit photographer.
Ooh.
By 1870, Mumler had already been formally accused of fraud and larceny, and had been put on trial, but the prosecution could not prove how Mumler had orchestrated the fraud, so he was ultimately exonerated. Point here is that this guy is a fraud. Spoiler alert.
I think you're jumping to conclusions, Sarah. I think that he's a really good source.
So Mumbler's session with Mary Todd ends up resulting in the picture which I'm showing Harley now. Harley, can you describe this photo for the listeners?
Okay, so there's this woman in all black, and who is this woman?
Mary Todd.
That's Mary Todd.
Yeah.
Okay. And she has someone who looks like the apparition of Abraham Lincoln behind her with his hands on her shoulders. It's very much like a outline ghost figure, and she doesn't seem aware that he's there.
Yeah, and you can see the facial hair too.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty compelling likeness, I think.
I feel
to
like
Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln has a very specific face shape.
Yeah,
like he had a very sharp jawline, and like it's just easy to tell that that's Lincoln.
Yeah, right.
Although there's no top hat, which I'm upset about.
I think it got cut off.
Oh,
he might have been.
naturally.
He might in the afterlife. He's still wearing the top hat. Don't worry, guys. So unfortunately, this does turn out to be a hoax.
Ugh.
I know. Mumler used this double exposure technique to create the Lincoln photo and hundreds of other spirit photos he created and conned people with throughout the years. Total bummer. He does actually, I believe, get found for like fraud and larceny and stuff like that later.
These are like the OG deep fakes in American politics.
Yes, exactly. Which is just, I mean, it's kind of sad because I bet when Mary Todd got that like photo, she's like, oh,
yeah.
wait, that's my hubby. Like he's with me. Like he's behind me. He's with me. And then to kind of down the line be like, oh, it was just a trick. I don't know.
It's also just creepy that someone would take the time to do that.
Right?
I don't like it.
People are just trying to make a buck.
R.I.P. He would have loved Photoshop.
He would have loved Photoshop. So it's unclear if Mary continued to look to spiritualists in her later life, but the rest of her life is just kind of heartbreaking in general. So on July 15th, 1871, her son Tad died at the age of 18, which was of probably what was a heart condition. And then, as I mentioned earlier, she was institutionalized by her eldest and only remaining son Robert in 1875, where she attempted suicide. Once she was released, she ended up living in Europe for a few years, but her health was quickly declining. And by the 1880s, Mary moved back to her sister's house in Springfield, Illinois, where she died of a stroke at age 63 on July 15th, 1882. And that is kind of a little bit about Mary Todd and her connection to spiritualism and creating seances and organizing them at the White House.
Wow, did not go where I expected it to. I thought for sure that the seances were going to start after her husband was assassinated and it was all about communicating with Lincoln.
Yeah.
But the fact that it, in some capacity, influenced policy decisions that the Lincoln administration made, wild.
Right. Because it seems like totally that Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Todd, went there for, comfort, about her sons who had like passed on and, being able to like see them and talk to them and stuff. But it is so interesting that then you have this whole other layer with Lincoln himself receiving policy suggestions
from beyond the grave.
From beyond the grave, yeah. That he maybe listens to?
Crazy.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to start a medium lobbying firm. It's a huge untapped market.
Yeah. I mean, who's gonna say no to George Washington? Who's gonna say no to George Washington? Come on.
I feel like we're onto something. We're onto something.
Next episode of Crime of Congress is us talking about our fraud that we did to create this.
No, not fraud. We just need to become mediums.
Yeah. First thing we have to somehow possess that gift.
Okay. I feel like anything's possible.
Maybe we hire someone. I don't know a lot about mediums at the end of the day.
That's true.
So I don't know if this is like more of a genetic thing. You're born with it, or a skill that you can develop over time. But I think that it might be too late for us in general.
Okay, so if you are a medium living in DC and you're interested in getting involved in lobbying, hit me up because I have a crazy idea.
We're gonna make millions.
Abraham Lincoln wants to talk to you, honey. So call me up.
That's a perfect place to end, I think.
I guess. It's something.
Would you like to gavel us out?
Finally.